This is an interactive breakout session, so if you would like to have your video on and you are suitably attired, please do so. We will be using the chat function here on Zoom, not on the Pathable site, and we will be bringing people in on video if they have questions to ask. We are going to stay on topic, and the topic is water. Huge amounts to talk about, and I'm delighted that we've got three speakers who represent three very important perspectives on water use and making it more sustainable in apparel and textiles. So we are exactly on the hour. I'm going to wait about another 30 seconds or so before we start, just so enough of you can join. And yeah, if you'd like to put your video on and talk to us, you'd be very welcome to. I shall make sure we have plenty of time for questions after we hear some opening points from our esteemed speakers. Okay, well, there's always a lot to talk about with water. Christina's going to start us off from CDP. I sent her a series of quite complex questions, which I then asked her to cover in just a few minutes. So don't worry, Christina, you don't have to cover all of them immediately, but whatever you can cover in some opening remarks without it turning into a Castro-style speech, you're very welcome to do so. Let's start at the beginning. Our question is, will science-based targets for water be the key? Well, the answer probably is that we don't know yet because we don't have them yet. But Christine's going to tell us about where we are with that. Then I'm going to ask Lisa to talk about where GAP is on this and some of the work they've been doing to improve water use. And then we'll turn to Simon, who will talk us through some of the technological innovations which are going to, we hope, revolutionize the industry and make cleaner water available for all. So, Christina, welcome. Feel free to give 2 sentences on CDP, but no more than that. And then please do tell us, where are we on science-based targets for water?
Absolutely. Excuse me. Well, thanks so much for having me. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're joining from. I'm joining from Denver, Colorado, so 7 a.m. for me, hence a bit of a frog in my throat, but we'll move past that. So I'm an Associate Director for Water Security at CDP. We are an environmental reporting platform, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I also co-lead the Freshwater Hub within the Science Based Targets Network alongside WWF. And we work with the Nature Conservancy and WRI and the Pacific Institute to be developing a methodology for science-based targets for water. And to answer your question, Toby, right now, the Water Hub within the Science Based Targets Network is planning to have a methodology to set science-based targets for water by the end of this year. And then after that, the next step is to have a validation process set up for science-based targets for water. So we anticipate that coming shortly thereafter. And just to provide a little background context, some folks on the line might be familiar with companies being able to set climate science-based targets to ensure they're cutting emissions at an ambitious enough pace and scale to play their part in halting climate change. And what the Science Based Targets Network is doing is really looking at nature science-based targets to enable companies to play their part in stopping nature loss. And so really happy to be here to talk about the freshwater side of that with you all.
Yeah, well, just while we're on that subject, Christina, tell us a bit more about the process that companies will go through for this, and just tell us a bit more about that, the development side of it.
Sure, yes. So there is an initial guidance that the Science Based Targets Network released last September, and I believe it's in the reading materials for this session if you all want to take a look at that, but you can also just Google Science Based Targets Network and you'll find the website and much more information alongside that guidance. But in terms of some thinking on the process overall, there is a framework which is looking at companies assessing their overall environmental impact across the value chain, so supply chain, direct operations, as well as product use and customers and end of life. And then understanding how to prioritize the areas of highest impact, measuring and setting the targets, and then actually taking action to implement those targets. And within that, there's a mitigation hierarchy of understanding if how a company should be avoiding So for example, avoiding certain hazardous chemicals, reducing water consumption or reducing certain pollutants, restore and regenerate. So understanding how you can be giving back to the ecosystem and the environments that you're working within, and then transform. And this is, we use a somewhat piratey acronym called ART for this, with those 3 R's in the middle for avoid, reduce, restore, regenerate, and transform. That's a very quick overview. There's a lot more in the initial guidance, and also a lot more details that we're working on the water side, but I'll stop there.
So when it comes to carbon, the CDP questionnaire has never been that easy for companies, and perhaps nor should it be, given if it was, it probably wouldn't be any good. But it's not an easy task to go through for some companies. I assume the water one will be, if not equally, then similarly complex. How is it set to be used? Because with CDP for GHGs, it has that added benefit of saying to investors, here's what companies are doing. Is it going to be the same thing with water? How are you making the business case, or how will the business case be made for companies to engage in this? Because you can see some boardrooms saying, oh, first climate, now water, where does it end? What's next?
Yeah, great points. I mean, I think that there is really a big push on nature right now. I think, we've seen this massive success with the Science-Based Targets Initiative for climate change. And, I'm speaking on the freshwater side, but there are also people who are thinking about methodologies for land use, for biodiversity, and for oceans. And ultimately, the Science-Based Targets Network methodology will help companies understand how to integrate all of that and to know if they're doing enough to address their impacts and dependencies on nature in the right places. So for companies, they can quantify their contributions on delivering their progress against these global goals that we have through the Sustainable Development Goals, through what might be happening on the Convention on Biological Diversity, and other sustainability commitments. And we do anticipate this is going to be a really valuable metric for investors as well, to know if their portfolios and their investment decisions are contributing to a nature positive future.
Are investors asking for this, or is something that you're putting in front of them and saying this is something you should be interested in? Trying to gauge the level of investor interest in water.
Well, I mean, on the science-based targets side, we definitely do have investors who are engaged with us and who are reviewing the methodologies, sense checking them. This has been a very collaborative process in making these with technical advisory groups, practitioner advisory groups. And we do also have investors who are coming to us and saying, is this something that we can use as a holistic, reputable metric to be able to understand how a company is doing on these fronts. And from my CDP hat, yes, investors are absolutely interested in water. I mean, there's the saying, if climate changes shark water as its teeth. We're feeling water right now and the impacts of it, whether that is due to climate change or water pollution or other elements. So I think investors are very much waking up to water and how companies are helping or harming water security.
Christina, thank you. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you. I certainly will have some more. Lisa, let me turn to you now. Thank you for joining us. I believe an early start for you as well. So thanks for getting up and getting involved with the conference. GAP's been doing a lot of work in improving supply chains for a long time. I was at the conference in 2004, where your then president announced the publishing of supplier lists, I think, for the first time. So I was very familiar with GAP's progress over the years around transparency and supplier engagement. What I don't know enough about is your progress on water. So I'd love to hear a bit about what you're doing with suppliers and perhaps bring it to life with some examples. Practical examples of where change has happened is always great to hear. So Lisa.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Lisa. I work with GAP Inc.'s sustainability team, and I focus on our water stewardship initiatives that spans across the enterprise. And just for some context, GAP Inc. is the parent company to the brands Old Navy, Gap, Banana Republic, Athleta, etc. And you know, in terms of where we are with water stewardship, water is, and how we approach it, water is critical. It's critical to the industry that we operate in. It's also very critical as a resource to the 70% of women who make up our value chain. So our focus is really driven by the belief that water is a human right. And we're focused on that intersection of women and water. And I think it's important to note too the localized nature of water and how it's important to be focusing on locally building water resilience, particularly for women. You know, in our case, a few of the areas that we're proud to be making progress on are that we achieved our goal to conserve 10 billion liters of water by 2020, and that's across our manufacturing partners. The other area that we're excited about is we recently launched a goal to empower 2 million people, of which 1 million people are women, to improve their access to water and sanitation in India. And these are in locations and communities where we're sourcing raw materials and where textiles are manufactured. The other area that we're looking to build out and really drive change and leadership on is as a founding member of the CEO Water Mandates Water Resilience Coalition. It's a group of cross-sectoral partners and industries that are advancing water resilience in priority water basins in that localized context through collective action. And by founding this group and putting forward, we're putting forward ambitious targets to, by 2050, have water resilient value chain and net positive water impact. So those are a few of kind of the guiding principles that kind of really drive home the importance of water for GAP Inc. and how we're looking to do that. You know, in terms of the topic around science-based targets and kind of what's in between our view on saving water, supporting women with access to water, and then building that community resilience, I think it's really important again, and I'll probably keep coming back to this during the conversation, is the contextual nature of water and how it's important, unlike climate, to really be thinking about what are those local needs. So what are the needs of the communities? Is it priorities around water quality, water quantity, and what are the solutions that can help us to get there? And so I think that that's the roadmap that we're on for, in part with science-based targets, and also looking at water as it's expressed in kind of these different needs, both human and for our natural environment.
Thank you, Lisa. Very interesting, those stats about the link with gender equality and water, and interesting to see your company joining up those social and environmental issues, which is, you know, for too long perhaps have been slightly separate in some organizations, looking at social and environmental in isolation. So that's a very interesting way to join it up and help join the dots. What would a typical engagement with a supplier look like at the moment around water? I mean, obviously we know with the various campaigns and actions that have happened in the last 10 years or so, there's been a big focus on cleaning up effluent from factories and installing new equipment. So what makes the case with a typical supplier? Is there such a thing? And is it all about the business case and the ROI rather than, say, for example, you know, gender equality? So what makes sense down at the factory level when you're looking at encouraging them to make the changes needed?
Yeah, I think in large part it's around some of the same issues that we're talking about. These are the challenges around water, water stress, the disproportionate burden that women bear on water, the high use of water in the apparel manufacturing sector. These are not distant issues to manufacturing partners. They are very close to home. They are right there in their backyard. They are experiencing water stress. It's how, as Christina mentioned, climate is experienced. And so there's certainly that kind of very tangible, close to home kind of drive for there's a need to do something. I would say that our approach to kind of working with our manufacturing partners is that second word. It's partnerships. We are partnering with our suppliers to be able to have achieved our 10 billion liter goal to conserve that amount of water across our manufacturing partners. And it's through partnership that we do that. We're also in partnership with our manufacturing partners to catalyze innovation in water stewardship. So we've partnered with a key supplier of ours, Arvind, in India, to develop a water innovation center for apparel, and also to co-invest in a water treatment facility where we're actually using gray water from local community as the input into the production process. So it's really about recognizing that this is a shared problem that the industry is facing, and coming together and figuring out how can we address this in concert.
Thanks very much. I'm sure we'll come back to many of those issues and have questions around that. So thank you, Lisa. Simon, turning to you. You know, when one learns a bit about water in the apparel and textile sector, one realizes there's an awful lot of waste around, and not just effluent, but actually water that's just sort of wasted more generally. And because of pricing issues and so on, it's not been valued perhaps as the resource it might be. So Simon, tell us about the technological innovations that are out there helping clean up some of these challenges and save us all time and resources. Simon, welcome.
Thanks, Toby. So I'm from a company called Alchemy Technology, and what we're doing is we're developing new manufacturing processes to reduce water, energy and chemistry consumption, primarily focusing on textile dyeing and textile finishing. Textile dyeing is probably the most water intensive part of the textile production process. So just to give you a feel for it, polyester is around about 50 tons per ton. So that's 50 tons of water per ton of polyester. Cotton's much higher, and cotton dyeing can be as high as 120 tons per ton to deliver dyed cotton fabric. So what we're doing with our technology is really looking to eliminate that water, both the water consumption and the water emission. You know, so textile dyeing is today typically performed in a big bath where the fabric is immersed in this bath for period of time, and then it's washed in that same bath with a lot of water. And so we're looking to really transform the way dyeing is done by eliminating the bath altogether, just applying the dye directly to the fabric and fixing the dye stuff into the fabric such that you get to a high level of colour fastness without the need for washing. You know, so that's really, you know, a pretty disruptive idea to the industry. The industry has been using bath-based dyeing for many years, you know, maybe over 70 years. There's a lot of installed machinery in the market, so there's a barrier to entry that manufacturers need to overcome. But certainly our perspective at Alchemy, having if you like, come into the textile industry from outside of it, is that the way that textiles are dyed and finished today really is unsustainable in principle. That the manufacturing principle is not sustainable. You know, so there's really a change needed in the overall manufacturing process principles used to apply colour to fabrics in general.
Thanks. So what are the barriers to rolling out of new technology here? Is it simply that factories have invested so much in legacy systems, they're just reluctant to spend the money? And how much does it cost to change all of this? I mean, the numbers you cited are pretty staggering. You know, you think about the beer industry being criticized for using 3 litres of water, 1 litre of beer. It's staggering compared to the numbers you've assessed. So Yeah, what are the barriers to getting some of this technology rolled out and being used?
Yeah, so I think the first point is that water consumption and emission in the textile industry is mind blowing. It's an incredibly polluting industry from a water emission perspective. There's several different barriers. So one I discussed a bit earlier is the capital equipment barrier. So to change how manufacturing is done, manufacturers and probably brands as well need to invest in new capital equipment. Manufacturers are reluctant to do that without brand support. And I think the traditional relationship between brands and manufacturers has been very much cost driven, which has not helped manufacturers adopt new equipment. The second barrier is really around risk. So manufacturers are generally quite risk averse, and they don't necessarily value water commensurate with its actual value in terms of its environmental impact. So input water into factories in certain parts of the world is low cost, and emissions of water, of contaminated water, can also be quite low cost, particularly if you're not treating the emissions. So manufacturers in general, are not necessarily incentivized in terms of the true cost of the environmental damage done by water emissions, because then they don't actually have to pay for it. And I think something that Lisa said earlier was quite important, that these water pollution problems are local. So it's unlike carbon emissions, which is also a global issue, although obviously the effects are felt locally. These wastewater emissions are felt very acutely by local communities, where the impact on them is not necessarily valued by the manufacturers in those communities. So I think that's, if there was a way to, if you like, take some global accounting of the water pollution and put some value to it in the local communities it's affecting, that could be quite helpful.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Christina, if you're not too busy, if you wouldn't mind sorting that out for next year.
Sounds like a job for someone to do. Yeah.
Well, Simon, forgive the ignorant and naive question. What's your business model based on? I mean, if we do have these challenges, which you've enunciated very clearly, how do we overcome them? Because surely your business model is partly based upon doing just that.
Yeah, so our business model is to sell technology and equipment to manufacturers who manufacture fabrics. We are innovating in terms of carbon reduction, water reduction, and cost reduction. So there's a strong business case for manufacturers to adopt our technologies. We, I guess, also recognise that there are quite a lot of externalities in terms of the benefits of our manufacturing approach, which aren't necessarily factored into the manufacturer's equations. So we are also looking to governments, non-government organisations, brands, to promote and encourage adoption of our technology, where the value of it to the sort of broader community can be greater than the value to the individual manufacturer.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a lot to be done, but what sort of companies are buying it? Is it companies based in the West? I mean, do you have I imagine there's a big potential market in emerging economies, for example, Vietnam or Bangladesh or somewhere. Is that where customers are? Or is it more those higher up, perhaps the sort of value chain elsewhere in Europe?
So the customers are generally vertically integrated, large-scale fabric manufacturers located primarily in Asia, also Turkey, some in the Americas. So we're generally working with, let's say, the top tier of manufacturers, generally larger manufacturers who've got sustainability agendas, who are closely linked to the brands, who I think will be the early adopters for technology because they have the scale and the ability to implement these technologies. Possibly, if you like, a broad problem for the industry is that there's a very long tail of small manufacturers in the textile industry, many of whom may be the more polluting manufacturers and who will find it more difficult to implement new technology.
Yeah, it's a problem the industry does not suffer alone, I think. Good question here. First question on the chat. Thank you, Andreas. I can bring you in on video if you like, Andreas. Why don't we see you? Are you there? Do you want to come in and ask your question face to face? There you are. You can put your video on as well. That'd be great.
Yeah, sorry, just the technicalities here. I'm coming from a partnership with a Danish company, Grundfos, which is a pumping manufacturer. We are working with Bangladesh in trying to sort of cross-subsidizing these two technologies, both in terms of drinking water access, in terms of effluent treatment water access. So I'm just thinking, is it something that you've looked into, especially going to Lisa, you told me about, you spoke about some of the projects that you've been doing. Have you looked into sort of this cross-subsidizing technologies together? That's just my question. Thank you.
And by and just to clarify a bit, you're looking to understand cross-subsidizing. Is this with, say, for example, public and private partnerships type of cross-subsidy? Yes. All right. So in terms of, our approach to that, absolutely. I think that is one of the approaches to unlocking some of these kind of investment challenges where there are mutually beneficial impact opportunities between the public and private sectors. In terms of the Water Innovation Center for Apparel that I mentioned, this is a very new initiative, and in the case of the actual investment, that was not something that we kind of focused on initially. Was kind of bringing in these subsidies or public-private partnerships. However, with the focus on the Innovation Center being really about catalyzing change across the industry, not just for GAP, not just for our partner suppliers, but recognizing that a systems change needs to happen, that will be an open and public forum, and we're looking to identify partners to help in that objective. The other area that I would mention is we have a lot of experience in public-private partnerships with our partnership with the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, on the USAID and GAP Inc. Women and Water Alliance. It's a 5-year, $32 million public-private partnership focused on improving water access for women and communities touched by the apparel industry. And it's really about understanding in that process how a public entity like the U.S. government, USAID, and GAP have a shared interest in advancing women's empowerment and wash services and products for the benefit of both community and really the resilience of that community where business operates.
Thank you, Lisa. So are there other questions or points we'd like to raise? We do have a bit of time. In the meantime, Lisa, perhaps you could tell us a bit about some of the other numbers you see in companies who are setting pollution-related water targets. This sounds like a really important area. So perhaps you can tell us a bit more about that, Christina.
Sure, yes. So through my CDP hat, we have thousands of companies who respond to our water security questionnaire, and we found that only 12% of those companies have targets related to water pollution and water quality, which is very low. And if you dive specifically into the apparel and textile sector, there were 80 companies who responded in 2020, and we found that 75% of those companies do have water-related targets, but less than 15% of them have a pollution reduction related target or goal. So we are definitely seeing within the sector that there should be more commitment and targets related to water quality. And so I'm really excited to be hearing about Simon's technologies and opportunities for companies, and definitely could see this fitting into on the science-based targets side of things, some of those actions that could come around avoid or reduction, but also an element of the transformation and innovation that we need to really be enabling the change that we need to see within the sector. So hopefully those statistics are helpful as a bit of a call to action on thinking about the quantity and the social side as well as the quality side is really important. And we're definitely noting that not just in the apparel sector, but in all sectors, lagging on having those high level commitments and targets related to water quality.
Thank you, Christina. Are there any particular regions of the world where you see a more progressive policy framework? It strikes me you almost need a kind of COP process for water targets, don't we, really, which might get pushed beyond municipal water use down to business and manufacturing quite quickly. That clearly isn't going to happen anytime soon, but do you know of any particular regions of the world where there's a progressive framework taking place that's really pushing this, or is it being done much more on a regional, sub-regional stress-based basis?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, I would say when it comes to water quality regulations, it tends to be quite local. But something I will point out, and I apologize if I'm getting this, I don't know this for certain, but I believe it was France or some other EU country that recently passed a regulation banning the essentially, if a clothing or apparel company makes too many clothes, there has been a practice where those clothes are, they aren't made available to others. They are burned or disposed of, and there are some laws coming down in the EU, and I believe specifically France, that are aiming to ban that practice. So I think that's something that is quite interesting to look at, and also really gets to some more of that transformation side of things. Of a great way to reduce impact is just avoid making too many clothes, which I know it's all about demand and it can be difficult to know ahead of time, but I think that's an interesting new type of regulation that I've been seeing discussed more.
Thank you. Simon, same question to you, really. I mean, you work a lot in Southeast Asia. I know you're working with the bigger companies, but have you come across any particular policy examples of where businesses are being pushed towards uptake of new technologies, either with financial or regulatory incentives?
Yeah, so we've certainly seen quite a lot of change in the industry, so particularly in China. So mainland China is seeing a lot of government regulating against emissions from dye houses. That's essentially moving it offshore, so it's generally moving it around the world rather than really eliminating it. And so I think what we would generally see is as countries become more prosperous, they will increase regulation. As we saw, the UK was the original dye house of the world, and it was essentially regulated out of the UK, ended up in the United States, and then ended up in China. And so I think we'll see that globally. We'll see migration of dyeing operations into lower cost countries. You do ultimately get to a point where there's nowhere else to go, and also many of these countries don't have the water availability to do dyeing. So I think what we're quite likely to see, I think, are countries where where dyeing has been moved to from mainland China, let's say Indonesia, Vietnam, maybe some other countries, where they'll have more there'll be increased local interest in regulating these manufacturers, because it's now much better known. I think the impact and the scale of the industry is very much greater than it was in, let's say, 1960s, 1970s, where local areas could tolerate the sort of water pollution problems, whereas now it's really very much bigger than it was 30, 40 years ago when dyeing first migrated into mainland China.
Thank you. And Lisa, similar question, I suppose, about what are the incentives available to suppliers who might want to make the change? Your organisation can't be expected to buy all their new equipment for them, or to buy Simon's technology and put it in their factories. So if they want co-financing, or they want some assistance and some incentives, is that improving the outlook for some of the big ones? And if so, where in the world is that happening?
That's a great question, and that's really a key unlock to, again, this challenge of investment in technology, and is in part why we have invested in the Water Innovation Center for Apparel, to explore just that, to, you know, really the technologies, the entrepreneurial aspect of how to make inroads and really leaps and bounds in terms of progress on these water quality and water quantity inputs into the apparel manufacturing process are key. And so technologies like Simon's are really that tip of the arrow to be able to prove out and then scale the need that is necessary. It is that scale that's where there's a lot of challenge at this point, but it's through innovative financing, it's through partnerships, and it's really about bringing together different stakeholders and actors to identify those solutions. But it certainly is, you know, we're touching upon the topic at hand right now, because we're seeing the innovations and opportunities out there. The big question is getting it to scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if there are those in the audience that might like to contribute, you've been an unusually quiet group, I have to say, in this breakout, apart from Andreas. Thank you, Andreas. If you have something more you'd like to ask or say, please do so. The rest of you seem to be determined to be anonymous, and I'm sure you have questions. So please do let us know if you do. We have about 14 minutes left, or we can finish early. I see we have a couple here in the chat. Thank you. So we have a good one here from Anne-Catherine Sharp from Flora and Fauna. Anne-Catherine, would you like to join us on video? Say hello, ask your question in person. Are you there? There you are, I believe. Welcome.
I am, sorry, hi. Hi, fascinating discussion, and I realise that I am slightly deviating away from water itself in terms of emissions, but I'm just curious to learn a bit more about, obviously knowing that filtering water from facilities at a fine enough scale to capture microfibers from textiles is, I mean, hugely onerous, if not impossible, at the volumes we're talking about. Does the issue of fiber emissions feature in these conversations? Is it something that's seen as high on the agenda, or is it still taking a bit of time to be part of the discussion?
That is actually a very good question, isn't it? We hear a lot about microparticle pollution in all aspects of life now, particularly whether it's your washing machine or the factories they're produced in. Christina, is this an issue on your agenda from a sort of disclosure reporting point of view? I mean, you know, plastics, you know, has been a huge issue in the last few years. I suppose it's one where the apparel sector and other areas like plastics kind of meet a bit.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say a few thoughts on this. One, that a target around microplastics or fiber loss would absolutely count in CDP disclosure as a water quality related target. And I believe we did see some of those come through. So we are starting to see some of those high level commitments from companies, and it's not necessarily, you know, quantifying how much microplastics are going to be removed, but a commitment around, you know, potentially R&D that is going to happen around how to better remove it. In terms of connecting this to emissions, I think absolutely there are linkages and trade-offs with so many water actions, and connecting that to emissions, or, you know, how that might be affecting biodiversity or other things. And certainly when you increase wastewater treatment, it's likely also going to increase emissions. So there's definitely a good amount of work, and especially in the lead up to COP, the climate negotiations happening in Glasgow in November. There's a lot of focus on the water utility sector, actually, and having them commit to only renewable energy. And I think those are the type of solutions that we want to see, is if there is an increase in wastewater treatment, understanding that that can be powered through renewable energy.
Thank you very much. Lisa, how much of this is on your agenda? I mean, clearly it's one of those many issues, isn't it, with regard to product impact that we're still trying to find out more about?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in two stages. First, it is absolutely a priority. It's something that, again, both our teams at GAP as well as the industry are currently grappling and exploring, really trying to figure out where are the right intervention points to get that balance between impact opportunity, piloting and testing, while also getting it to scale across a large network of supplier partners with various kind of characteristics and in various locations. So I'll say that it's top priority and we're working on it to figure out how to address that. The second way I'll answer it though too is a bit broader in terms of how we think of sustainability overall. A majority of the impacts of clothing are really decided from the outset during the design process. So actually trying to design out any of that microfiber impact in this example is really getting out ahead of the problem as well. And so figuring out what does that look like? Is there a way to design out that issue? In addition to different types of models, circularity models around reuse of clothing and even fabrications, how to look at bringing that into a circularity system. So there are a lot of different prongs to looking at the challenge, both from what's, if you will, coming out in terms of effluent, what's going in at the beginning from the design stage, and really how to quantify and identify those impacts is also key.
Thank you. Simon, how equipped is modern technology to deal with this challenge? It must have come up on your agenda. Indeed, is it part of technology output ready? Tell us.
Yeah, it has a bit. I think the emission of microplastics from textiles is actually a very difficult problem to solve. Because it really relates to how textiles are used through the whole chain, so how often they're washed, what happens in the washing machine. Some of it is obviously emitted in the manufacturing process as well. I think in general it's going to be an issue that's going to become higher and higher on the agenda because people get more and more concerned, I think, about potential effects of accumulation of these small plastic particles in the environment. There's not a lot that can be done easily, I don't think, other than moving to natural fibres where you have a degradable material. So this is already related to polyester and nylon materials in the environment. So I think technologically there may be some solutions at a plant level where maybe you can filter out microplastics from a production process, but really it's all going to be in the washing machine. So a lot of the emissions will be in domestic washing machines going out into the environment.
Yeah, so a future washing machine may have a sort of cartridge, a bit of it you empty.
It might do, yeah. You
recycle your microplastics. Well, I mean, it sounds like a practical solution. As Lisa said, it's got to be addressed in the design stage in many cases, but it's certainly an area which is quite frightening for a lot of people. I think it's obviously the human health impacts of microparticle plastics ingestion are unknown. And I guess we'll find out more as the years pass. We do have an interesting scenario-based question here, which I will put to you all in closing in a minute. We're about 7 minutes left, so I don't know if you can see Anton Firth's question, which I'm going to put to you all as we close. But let me just put a quick question from Laurent Anon to you, Christina, before we do that. He says, water and hygiene in the first line of defense against the spread of diseases such as COVID. These services are lacking in apparel supply chains based in water-stressed countries. Is CDP including hygiene targets and indicators in their reporting framework?
I will keep this short, but the answer is yes. And we have partnered with WaterAid to provide the data related to WASH, so water access, sanitation, and hygiene, from companies reporting to CDP to WaterAid, and they actually published some great reports and business cases on the importance to businesses on making sure that both their employees and the communities where they operate have safe, equitable access to drinking water and water for sanitation and hygiene.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's move towards what I think might be a closing question from Anton Firth. He says, which scenario do you think is more realistic? Number 1, improvements in wastewater treatment technology and deployment from existing aqueous dyeing effluents. Or 2, deployment of new waterless dyeing technologies. Simon, I'll ask you to vote first and tell us why. I suspect you may choose the second option, but let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah, so I'd obviously prefer the second option. I think the answer is probably a bit more sophisticated in a sense. I think both are necessary. So in the short term, certainly there needs to be big improvements in the way wastewater is treated. In terms of which scenario is more realistic, I think there's a fundamental issue with scenario number 1, that it's technically just not feasible to reduce the impact of wastewater emissions from current textile processing, simply because the volume of water and the amount of discharged chemicals is so high that you can't economically treat it, you can't technically treat it. So I think in the long term, waterless technologies will become standard in the industry. Probably the sort of supplementary question is, how long would it take to implement new technologies? And just to give you a feel for it, there's a need for between 20 and 30,000 machines if we were to move over from current technology to new waterless dyeing processes. It's certainly not going to be a quick process, but in terms of what we've seen in the market, we've seen enormous interest in a technological solution to the emissions of wastewater from dyeing, rather than just trying to treat the tons and tons of wastewater that are emitted by dye houses. Yeah, so I think the appetite is certainly there for option number 2. But I don't think you can ignore option number 1, because you do need it in the short term to deal with what's a fairly immediate issue in many places in the world.
Thank you. Christina, what are your views on this? Similar, I imagine?
Yes, I have to admit I was a bit distracted responding in the comments to and Catherine commenting that France already has a law around washing machines being fitted to capture microplastics.
That's okay. No problem. Lisa, let me put the question to you then. I mean, we're probably a bit closer to it as well, working with suppliers directly. Do your views echo Simon's?
Yeah, it's really about both at this point. I don't think we have the option to think about an either or scenario, given the enormity of the challenge and the scale of the industry, and where different stakeholders sit along the spectrum of kind of progress towards improvement. So in terms of, I do just want to call out one other aspect about, because water quality has come up quite a bit, and effluent, that is an initiative within the apparel industry. I think I saw it mentioned in the chat earlier, zero discharge for hazardous chemicals. And so that's an initiative of the industry to really look at how to make improvements to those specific chemicals that are hazardous through, again, that two-pronged approach that I mentioned, not only looking at the effluent side of things, but first and foremost, the input side. What are those chemical inputs that we want to make sure are not included in any of the design process? And we're actively working with the ZDHC group and apparel industry to make inroads into that approach. And then in terms of the innovation side of things, again, that is the tip of the arrow in terms of opportunity, and where we need to be focused to make that step change progress that's critical to our shared natural water resources.
Great. Excuse me. Well, that seems like a good place to close. We're about 1 minute too, so probably not much time for further questions. Otherwise, I'll run over like I always do. So I think we'll leave it there. Lisa, thank you so much for your time and insights. Equally, Simon and Christina, it's been a fascinating discussion. I'm sure we've all learned a lot. We're going to take a brief break now before we come back for our last 2 sessions of the day, and very much look forward to continuing the debate there. In the meantime, thank you all for your time and your engagement and your contributions. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Toby. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.